In the biggest challenge to abortion rights in decades, the Supreme Court's conservative majority recently signaled they would allow states to ban abortion much earlier in pregnancy and may even overturn the nationwide right that has existed for nearly 50 years. What does this mean for women's rights, especially poor and women of color? Are they going to be able to make their own decisions about their reproductive health? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
On Wednesday of last week, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a Mississippi abortion case that restricts abortions to 15 weeks. Many believe it is the most consequential case in over 40 years, putting the fate of Roe v. Wade in the hands of a Supreme Court that has undergone enormous changes and currently sits at a 6-3 conservative majority. With hundreds of demonstrators outside chanting for and against, the justice-led arguments that could decide the fate of the court's historic 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, legalizing abortion throughout the United States, and its 1992 ruling in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which reaffirmed Roe. The outcome won't be known until next June or so, but after 2 hours of arguments, all 6 conservative justices, including 3 appointed by Donald Trump, indicated they would uphold the Mississippi ban. That hearing has women and Democratic senators all over the country, well, quite literally freaking out. Here to help us make sense of it all are returning guest Professor Margalynne Armstrong, a law professor at the Santa Clara University School of Law, and Professor Samuel Moyn, a professor of law at Yale Law School and author of Human, How the Unabandoned Peace, let me start that again. The book is called Human, How the U.S. Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. Good morning and welcome, Professor Moyn and Professor Armstrong. I wanted to have 2 of the leading scholars, Constitution law scholars, here this morning to help us make sense of what we saw and heard during that questioning of the big Supreme Court argument last week. We're getting to a peek into these arguments now because of COVID. So I want to start with you, Professor Moyn. How much, should we read into the questions that were asked by the justices, particularly the conservative justices on the court?
It's nice to be with you. I think we can read a lot in, although you never know what's going to happen until the opinion is issued, likely next June. In this case, it seemed clear that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, was looking for some sort of compromise that would allow the court to uphold the Mississippi law banning abortions before 15 weeks without overruling Roe v. Wade. But the other conservatives weren't buying it. And so it seems very likely to many of us that Roe v. Wade's days are numbered.
And let's talk about that interaction, Professor Armstrong, that we saw between the justices. So it looked like Justice Kavanaugh and Stephen Breyer got into a heated exchange over whether the court should overturn precedent. Kavanaugh saying that the court has a history of overturning significant cases, citing Brown versus Board of Education as a case that overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, and other examples that he cited. But Breyer said that this was a false equivalency. Help us understand that argument, because that's huge, this whole concept of, can we overturn precedent? I think you're still on mute, Professor Armstrong.
Sorry. Justice Kavanaugh referred to a number of minor cases, or at least cases that weren't as significant as Brown versus Board of Education. And so part of Justice Breyer's argument was that you're comparing kind of tiny apples with these great big cases that are very important. And really, there aren't that many cases that were overturning precedent of such importance. The Supreme Court will often look at past decisions and kind of tweak what they've done in the past. But with respect to overturning precedent that's been relied on for a number of years, the court doesn't do that often. So a lot of the overturned cases are just precedents that were clear they didn't work out very well after a few years. So there is a difference between what Justice Kavanaugh was saying and the importance of a case like Roe in terms of the significance and the reliance that people have made on the case.
And Professor Moyn, Justice Alito noted that while a woman may want to terminate a pregnancy after viability, he said something that was really shocking to a lot of, pro-choice advocates, and that was a fetus has an interest in having a life before and after. Was he redefining, how we think of viability and the whole concept? I mean, to say that a fetus has an interest is basically giving person status to a fetus.
Now, if the Supreme Court were ever to hold that fetuses from the moment of conception have constitutional rights, that would mean that states couldn't legalize abortion. Right now, the argument seems to be whether they can legalize it if they want or ban it if they want. And Justice Kavanaugh held that out as the likely decision that's coming. But it's true that as soon as it comes, if it comes this spring or summer, the pro-life movement will advocate for a federal right to personhood for the fetus. And I think Justice Alito was kind of anticipating that next front for this, conservative majority on the court. I don't think that anyone believes that we'll reach it in this round of the argument.
But Professor Moyn, going back to what you said about Kavanaugh kind of laying the foundation for the states being able to legalize or not legalize abortion, he went into this argument basically saying like the Constitution is silent on abortion. Help us understand, how he was getting to that argument.
Well, so he begins from the proposition that the Constitution has these, abstract promises of liberty and equality. And if there's a federal right in the federal Constitution, it only should restrict the states if the Supreme Court is really sure that a given right is in the Constitution. And conservatives have worried for decades now that while liberty and equality are mentioned in places like the 14th Amendment, the post-Civil War amendment, the right to an abortion is not. And so if Roe v. Wade is deleted, it leaves states free to make policy however they would like, since there's no longer a federal right that would restrict their legislation. And so the likely outcome then would be, with people no longer fighting over the meaning of the federal Constitution, that states, the southern states especially, would pass abortion bans immediately, right. Just like Mississippi's, whereas a lot of other states would leave it legal.
But Professor Armstrong, the Constitution hasn't changed much in the 50 years since the deciding of Roe v. Wade, and last Wednesday. So how is it we go from, well, the Constitution is silent on abortion, last week, but, the Roe decision some 50 years ago?
Well, the decision is based on the interpretation of the protections of liberty in the Constitution. And you actually have to go back to a previous case, Griswold versus Connecticut, which protected the right to birth control use first by married families, and then it expanded to pretty much everyone. So what does liberty mean? Because if the states cannot interfere with your liberty, then if liberty includes the right to choose an abortion or to pursue birth control, or even to have relations with people of the same gender, if liberty doesn't protect those things, then the Constitution lack of the specifics of what is protected means that we have a lot fewer liberties or protections than we recognize now. And so what the justices are talking about when they say it's not in the Constitution is just a kind of literal reading of the Constitution as opposed to interpreting what liberty means.
Professor Moyn, that sounds like a very dangerous argument, because I'm thinking of all of these other ways that we have interpreted the Constitution to provide protections for our liberties. So if you buy Kavanaugh's argument, could we go back to states saying, separate but equal is okay, or states saying you don't have the right to marry the same sex, or you don't have the right to birth control? Those things aren't explicitly stated in the Constitution either.
If you leave what the Constitution means up to 9 people, you'll have a war over who gets to be on the court. And the conservatives have played out a strategy over the half century since Roe v. Wade to get the upper hand on the court, which means that they control the meaning of the Constitution. So this is, why some of us think that we should have the court less in charge of the Constitution, because that means that it's no longer up to us what liberty means, what equality means. Now, nobody thinks that even this court, which is reactionary, is going to undo Brown v. Board of Education. But Professor Armstrong's right that it's very unclear if Roe v. Wade was wrong, according to these 5 or 6 conservative justices, how the Obergefell v. Hodges decision, which declared a liberty interest in marrying a member of the same sex, survives. And the damage could be ongoing for years or decades if Roe v. Wade is overruled.
Yeah, you're a little bit more optimistic, Professor Moyn, than I am, because the same, the same people that are driving this Roe v. Wade challenge are some of the same people that are anti-gay marriages, that are anti Black folks and people of color, and anti-immigration, and Black Lives Matter, and things that we value, or some of us in this country value. So that's a little scary. Okay, Professor Armstrong, I got to just let that sit, because that's huge. But let's talk about this adoption question. So Amy Coney Barrett, we know she's a mother of 5. She's adopted 2 kids. So she goes off on this thing about, safe haven laws. And, women, it's not really all that big of a deal. Just have the baby and drop it off at a fire station and police station. I'm being kind of tongue in cheek, but she did suggest that there is no burden to a woman from having a baby because they have the ability to have a child adopted. Was that surprising to you?
Well, it was surprising, but it's a lot like The Handmaid's Tale in terms of the idea that a woman's body is there to reproduce children, and once she's pregnant, she has the obligation to go through with that, and she doesn't have to bear the burden of raising the child, but she does have to go through the pregnancy, because what the justice was arguing was essentially that the pregnancy is entitled to due process protection. And so the law cannot allow there to be an abortion. It's really a kind of extreme argument in terms of the fetal personhood, as Professor Moyn was talking about. And so if the fetus and the woman are equally protected by the law, then the woman has the obligation, or the state has the obligation, to protect the fetus until it's born. So that's the gist of her argument. And it was somewhat surprising because it's such a thrust into fetal personhood so quickly.
And Professor Moyn, we didn't hear a lot of arguments about the reality of giving birth in this country, which is that it's very dangerous, particularly for women of color. Maternal mortality rates are 3 to 4 times higher for Black women than they are for white women. There's a horrible story in LA Times or Variety this morning about a young 33-year-old woman gives birth at one of the best hospitals in Southern California. 2 days later, she's dead. So having birth is no simple feat, as Amy Coney Barrett seems to make it be. And I've had 3 kids, so I can attest to that firsthand. But there also was some conversation about incest and rape, which also are not, exceptions under this Mississippi law. Was that surprising to you, Professor Moyn, that no consideration was given, one, to the dangers of childbirth, and then this whole no exception for rape or incest, which is basically saying if a 15-year-old girl is raped by her father, she has to have that child.
No, it's extraordinary, and it points. You're pointing out, some of the kind of ironies, in the oral argument. Justice Kavanaugh, who, as you mentioned, cited Brown v. Board and said sometimes we have to overrule noxious precedents like Plessy v. Ferguson, which Brown v. Board overruled, failed to mention that Roe v. Wade is above all a case that protects women of color, not just women in general. And Amy Coney Barrett is an absolutely pivotal figure. I'm sure the Chief Justice is trying to recruit her for a more kind of moderate decision, but she is the only mother on the court, and she has a lot of symbolic importance in, let's say, communicating the outcome to a big and diverse nation. I think it's extraordinary that these exceptions you mentioned were almost not discussed. You could hope that the situations you mentioned will lead the court to protect some kind of federal abortion right, so that states can't ban abortions when in cases of incest or the threat to the mother's health. But we don't know what will happen.
And we heard Sonia Sotomayor talk about the stench. She made reference to the fact that the group that brought this lawsuit basically openly acknowledged the court's change. Hey guys, we got 6 votes on the court now. Now's the time to try to change this, Roe decision. So they weren't being, shy about or clandestinely going about trying to change this historic decision. They were being pretty clear that this was a politically motivated lawsuit. Professor Armstrong, if the court allows itself to be manipulated by individuals like this, what confidence at all can we as Americans have in the court?
Well, this entire case is a huge challenge to the authority of precedent. And Sotomayor, and you are absolutely right in terms of the state of Mississippi's legislature said, we are going to defy law as it's been settled by the Supreme Court in order to have this law changed. And so by doing that, they are undermining the precedent, which means that any precedent that is created by this court now is similarly in a position to be undermined. And it seems like the strategy, if Roe is overturned by this court, is to take political action to try to neutralize the court. And that would mean that there should be the attempt to have a legislature, a federal legislature, a Senate, that is willing to essentially pack the court and put more justices on it who would overturn this decision. It's a terrible slippery slope by just overturning Roe versus Wade in terms of recognizing the authority of the court. And the stench is the political situation. And furthermore, with respect to this court, at least 2 of the justices are not there legitimately. When you look at what happened when Scalia died and the nomination of Merrick Garland was held for 290 days. Amy Barrett Cohen's case was her hearing was 30 days after the nomination. So Trump got an extra appointment. And then there was, of course, Justice Kavanaugh, who showed this complete lack of judicial temperament in the hearing. And yet every Republican who voted for him ignored the fact that he had shown to the whole nation that he really wasn't somebody who should be in the position of one of the leading justices or judges in the nation.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought him up again because Professor Moore, not only did he show a lack of judicial temperament, some say he lied. You know, he talked at that hearing about the importance of precedent. And then in that argument, he's saying, well, maybe we've got to overturn precedent. So these hearings where Senate potential justices go before these Senate committees and they take these positions, are we not to expect them to live up to what they say to these Senate bodies, to the American people? Because it seems like he just did a total, 360, and he just totally flip-flopped, and there's no recourse for it. So you can say whatever you want to say to get appointed, tell whatever lies you want to tell, try to appear as neutral as possible, then get on the court and do the exact opposite. And we, the American people, are stuck with you.
Well, both Barrett and Kavanaugh said that Roe v. Wade was an important precedent of the court. You know, they gave themselves a leeway to change their mind. And as you say, no one's stopping them now. You know, I think we have to go back and revisit figures like Maine Senator Susan Collins, who provided decisive votes in the confirmation of these judges out of her sense that they were trustworthy when it came to Roe v. Wade. But unlike these justices, she's an elected official, and she's now sent the country down one path rather than another. And I think, the voters can think about what they want to do about it.
Well, we did see Democratic senators, big article in the Washington Post right after the arguments saying, this sense of urgency now to address the Supreme Court and lots of suggestions. We know Biden has this committee that's studying the court right now, but there's the suggestion of expanding it, from 9 to 13, possibly even 15, term limits, forced retirement. But Professor Moyn, can we expand the court by simply getting rid of the filibuster and having a Senate majority vote versus some kind of constitutional amendment?
Oh, no, I think it's generally agreed that the court can be expanded by statute. It just has to pass the Senate, which would require in our world the abolition of the filibuster. I think, it's a potentially risky move if you think the Republicans are coming back in a divided country, because they'll just pack it again. I personally would favor a federal abortion rights statute and using statutory tools to protect it from the court. You can, for example, strip the court's jurisdiction over an abortion rights statute, and it might be a better way of securing rights for women that I think our Constitution ought to guarantee and that the Supreme Court isn't going to protect anymore.
Yeah. And what about you, Professor Armstrong? What are your final thoughts in terms of how we deal with what seems to be coming very quickly, which is the elimination of federal abortion protection across this country, leaving millions of women, particularly in southern states and Midwestern states that are run by conservative majorities, with very little options in terms of their reproductive health choices?
Well, one of the limitations of a federal abortion statute, which I think is actually a very good idea, is that there's so many different privacy rights that have been established under the precedent that goes back to Griswold. So are we going to have a national statute protects the ability of people to marry no matter what their gender is? Are we going to have a federal statute about birth control? I'm just concerned that in terms of the lack of recognition of a privacy right, that it's really going to be a kind of endless struggle to protect the kind of gains that have already occurred in terms of the courts recognizing this right. And it's really a conundrum. I mean, the idea of going back and forth between Republicans and Democrats in terms of who's on the court, where will it end, really? And so it's somewhat frustrating that we're in this position in the first place. And it would really be something if we could really get judges to tell the truth, to be circumspect in their decisions, so that that kind of stench that Justice Sotomayor was discussing isn't there. We can't trust this court because it's so clearly political. And we've been close to this before. I mean, the Bush versus Gore case was another situation where the court was very anti-majoritarian in its decision. So we really need to have a reckoning about what the role of the court is. Maybe we should end judicial review. The court made it up, speaking of things that aren't in the Constitution.
Well, excellent point. We've got to leave it there. A novel thought, justice is to tell the truth. How about that? Maybe that would solve all of these problems. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Moyn, Professor Armstrong. Obviously, we're going to be following this. That Roe case is coming down the pipe. There's a gun law case coming. Lots of big issues that the Supreme Court is going to have to deal with. And we'll be keeping an eye on what happens to our privacy rights, because that has me really worried. The erosion of our privacy rights, a big issue we all should be concerned about. But again, thank you both so much for your insights this morning. Okay, my next guest knows a whole lot about telling the truth. His name is Frank Schaeffer. He's the best-selling author of more than a dozen books. Frank's latest book is Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. He's also the host of the podcast In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Good morning and welcome, Frank. So, Frank,
Hi.
You got an interesting background. You grew up as a conservative, a fundamentalist Christian, but later in life you became a liberal Democrat and a self-described Christian atheist. I was reading in your voluminous background that you actually helped produce Ronald Reagan's book, Abortion and the Conscience of a Nation.
Yes, I did. And before that, unfortunately, and it's so sad for me in the context of this conversation, when I was a young man, actually in my late teens, as the nepotistic sidekick to my famous evangelist theologian father, Francis Schaeffer, we were very instrumental in doing something that most people today, Areva, have no idea happened. I think today, listening to that abortion discussion, if you ask most of your listeners, have evangelicals always been anti-abortion? Have they always been Republicans? Most folks today, 50 years later, would think that, yes, it's kind of like the Roman Catholic Church, it goes with the territory. That's a lie. When we made a film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who then became Ronald Reagan Surgeon General, we went out to a series of seminars in venues like Dallas and Madison Square Garden and other places where we had been a couple years before with another film series my father made called How Should We Then Live? On art and culture and philosophy. And we had filled these stadiums, 25,000 people. We filled the Grand Ole Opry. My father was a huge best-selling author in that evangelical subculture. Now, maybe people outside of that hadn't heard of him, but he was a very big deal in that world. Mm-hmm. And we were close personal friends with Dr. Reverend Billy Graham, the big evangelist, all the televangelists. I was on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson maybe half a dozen times. Jerry Falwell, the original Jerry Falwell, not Jerry Falwell Jr., lent me his jet when I was in my early 20s to fly around the country on a speaking tour. So we were the religious right in those days. When we went out with our series on abortion, and here's the thing most people don't know, most evangelical leaders either described themselves as pro-choice. They didn't use those words then because they hadn't been codified yet, pro-choice, pro-life, but they were for women having the right to abortion. Dr. Billy Graham, Dad and I met with him 3 times, actually, weirdly, at the Mayo Clinic where my dad was undergoing cancer treatment. Billy would come in for checkups twice a year. And we begged him to get on board. And Billy said, look, Francis, I've supported you all these years on everything else you've done. I can't do this. I can't preach the love of Christ to women and tell them to do something I couldn't do, which is have a child I don't want. Dr. Criswell, president of the Southern Baptist Convention, that was the epicenter of evangelical fundamentalism at the time. Right-wing conservative Christianity was not only pro-choice, he preached on it and wrote on it using biblical references to why he thought women should be allowed to have abortion.
So when the big shift, Frank, what happened? So you've given us the background. You're telling us that these conservative evangelicals were originally pro-choice, even before pro-choice was a popular frame, but then something happened.
Well, sadly, a couple things happened, and I'm one of them. And this new book I wrote that you mentioned, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, is a kind of an apology. It is my pro-family book, my pro-woman book from a man who, as a teenager, and a 20-something nepotistic sidekick, somewhat brainwashed, by the way, in the evangelical community. It's an apology for that. It's real family values that start with, guess what? Women's rights. And so when you get to a point in history where women are being denigrated and being treated as second-class citizens, sadly, in the rolling back of Roe v. Wade, a lot of this goes back to my dad, to Dr. Sierbert Koop, and to the film series I made. And there were other things involved, like Paul Weyrich was doing a switcheroo. He was a Roman Catholic activist on the far, far fringe of the right. And he talked Jerry Falwell and others into taking a, quote, stand against abortion based on the fact that they had failed to keep their schools segregated. These were segregationists openly back in the day, and that this would be more raw meat to throw people who had wanted to start white academies hadn't been able to do it.
What year was this happening, Frank? This time that this Roman Catholic activist is convincing the far right to take on this pro-life? From about
1970, when Nelson Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan were legalizing abortion in California and New York through Roe v. Wade and out the other side. And then we came with our film series, as I talk about in the book. And what I point out is that what we did, in essence, was nothing to do with abortion. This is the other big lie. It wasn't about abortion. It was pure misogyny. And I have to explain something to your listeners, which I'm sure you're aware of, and that is that if you are raised in an evangelical fundamentalist background, especially a Calvinist background like I was in the Presbyterian conservative wing or the Southern Baptist, whatever it is, you are raised being taught from the time you are a toddler that men are supposed to be in charge of women, that wives must obey their husbands. What the evangelicals hated about the abortion ruling was the same thing they hated about feminism to begin with. And that is, it broke the idea that women are second-class citizens and subservient to men. It took women out from under the control of men. And all that is happening in the Supreme Court, tragically, as I talk about in the book and in other places, with a big assist from my family in the 70s and the 80s and the religious right, is to try to put the idea that women should have equality back in the box. Look, I admit in the book and elsewhere that I was basically raised to be a jerk by divine right. In other words, all testosterone-driven young men tend towards being sort of bullying of people around them, and gradually they become a little more civilized, more nuanced. They look at themselves, they fall in love, as I did with Jeannie, my wife I've been with for 52 years, and they begin to modify their beliefs. And as I did that, I had a choice: either be a good husband from the biblical, misogynist, patriarchal point of view, or be a good human being, which meant that I had to leave that faith behind with a great deal of struggle and lost family relationships. And that's what started my process of coming out of that movement. It was that I was sick of being a bully. I was sick of being a jerk. And so what I talk about in the book in terms of abortion is that abortion is not a woman's issue as it's normally portrayed. It is a basic human rights issue that men should be as exercised about as women. And that is that if we have 52% of our population is living under this gun of pregnancy that men never suffer, I've had 3 kids, you've had 3 kids, we understand this. I haven't had babies, but I've sat next to my wife as she bled and had a forceps delivery and nearly died. I have watched her in the bathroom at night bleeding when we were together, wondering if it's a miscarriage. This is no picnic. And the idea that any man, any male, any culture has a right to tell a woman what she is supposed to do about this basic unfairness that has been vested into the human dynamic by biology or evolution or God, however you want to see creation, is absurd. And so I am angry with myself for my stupidity as a young man. I am deeply sorry for what we did. I can't stand the idea that my granddaughters and my daughters and my wife are treated in this disrespectful way, that I'm living in a culture where 52% of the population is owed an apology for this even being discussed. And that's my point of view. And I've felt that way for the last 35 years. I bailed, but I just want to say again, I bailed because I was sick of being a bully. And I was sick of being a bully in a relationship with a woman I loved. And I chose her over the way I was raised. And I don't think people understand that this
thank
this
you.
whole anti-abortion juggernaut is an anti-woman juggernaut. And the fact that some women sign on, like Amy Coney Barrett, because they too have been delusional in their faith, and they have been programmed in the same way I was, but never broke free. And lastly, when you look at the Federalist Society and these people who are grooming all these judges to come out like Amy Coney Barrett, it's a project that my father helped start more than 50 years ago. He went around law school saying, don't be a preacher, go into the law. We need to change the law. You need to go through the system and become a judge. Yale Law School, all these other places. And it happened. So I was there at the beginning of this project. I talk about it in the book and other places.
Well, let me ask you this, Frank. Let me ask you this. What was your epiphany? You've just laid out so brilliantly everything that I know, everything that any, conscious woman, if you woke up this morning, you know this. You know that we live in this white, heteronormative, cisgender, patriarchal system, and that abortion rights is about controlling women and keeping women subservient to men. We know that. Those, women, we know that. Most of us, I shouldn't say all of us, most of us have had that awakening. What was your awakening moment? What was your epiphany moment?
I mean, this sounds, Oprah-esque and Hallmark card, but I'll tell you the truth. It was loving Jeannie. I got her pregnant when we were 17 and 18. We've been together 52 years. And as I went forward, she came from a very different background. I had a series of choices. I'm going to keep treating her badly because I want to be in charge, even though she doesn't agree, or I'm going to change. And I changed because I loved her. And then once you tug at one thread of a tapestry of conditioning and brainwashing and question any of it, it wouldn't matter what the road is, soon it all falls apart in your hand because it was a tissue of lies. And the lies are that somehow women were created to be different than men in terms of their rights, subservient to men. This is part of the theology I was raised on. People don't get that. It's part of the Roman Catholic theology. And when it comes to are these people really pro-life? Hey, I would believe they were pro-life if they were fighting for paid parental leave. I would believe they were pro-life if women working 3 jobs weren't going back to their J job 2 days later, still bleeding from a delivery because there's no medical care for them and no free medical care. There's no paid leave. I would believe it if Pete Buttigieg wasn't mocked by the same right-wing commentators that call about family values. And so, essentially what I've tried to do is I spent 6 years writing a book explaining why I do childcare for 3 of my 5 grandchildren. I have for 13 years. I don't mean I help out. I mean, I canceled speaking engagements for the last 13 years so I could be at home. I'm going from this interview to do a school pickup, and I've already prepared some chicken soup for my 7-year-old Nora, who will be coming to the house. I put my money where my mouth is.
Right. How do we get they're not your peers now, they're your fellow peers because you left the club and now you're calling out the club members. What can be done to further expose what you are exposing now, which is 100% accurate? How do we continue to cause people to understand the truth about this whole, conservative movement? Because you just hit the nail on the head when you say if you're so pro-life, then you would be for paid medical leave. You would be for assistance for families who are struggling. You would support, better education in poor communities. There's this laundry list of things that you would support that we know you don't. How do we continue to call out the hypocrisy and hopefully open more eyes?
I think we have to restate what feminism is. And I've got a whole chapter in my book on that. And that is feminism is an evolutionary step upon which the survival of the human race depends. We've seen what male leadership has done to this planet. We've seen what Bolsonaro and Trump and these bumptious fools do, marching around lying about COVID because they don't want to look bad. Male leadership has had its day, and this may be weird coming from this old white guy here you're watching on your program, but I really, really believe that we have to understand that either we take account of the full humanity of the female in our culture and the burden she bears, and we fight for her, and not just on abortion. Give you one other example. We fight against this corporate mentality that tells her to wait till she's 40 to try to have a baby or she won't be taken seriously. And so now she's doing IVF and spending $180,000 because she wants a baby, because the dirty little secret is my daughter's a CEO of a company in New York. I know what I'm talking about because Jessica and I swap emails all the time in terms of what she faced. We pretend that somehow women are not only second-class citizens when it comes to abortion, but that their careers depend on them pretending they're not women when a woman does want to bear a child. And we go right down the list of things and we treat women horribly. So my point of view is the first thing we have to do is understand that feminism has to be embraced root and branch as the only way we are going to dig our way out of an environmental climate crisis, the only way we're going to dig our way out of an educational crisis, and even a crime crisis. You know, we're in a culture where the male has behaved very badly, and it's time for men to stand up and say, I'm really, really sorry, over to you. And then when it comes to these issues, understand that these are not, quote, women's issues that have nothing to do with men. In the same way that Black Lives Matter was not only to do with Black people. If you want to live in a culture where a Black man can be shot for being Black, be my guest. If you want to live in a culture where a woman is forced to bear a child after being raped, be my guest. I don't want to live there. And I spent 6 years working on a book to declare what I call real family values. And I've spent the last 35 years fighting against what you might call my former stupid self. Yeah. And I am ashamed for what we did. And I am sad that it's come to fruition, not only in this horrible Supreme Court situation, but in the dumb thing we did in electing Donald Trump, which was the final vomiting, if you want to put it that way, of the right-wing agenda that we helped hatch back in the 70s and the 80s.
Well, I want to first of all thank you, Frank, for that apology. And, you know, I just wish I could bottle up everything you said and give it to every member of that, you know, those evangelical tribes and communities out there that keep pushing this false narrative. We're going to definitely have you back. Want to hear a lot more about your book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. Go pick up your grandchildren, give them that great chicken soup. I can't wait to get you back to go deeper into not only this book, but you've written, you know, a dozen or more incredible books. I really appreciate you sharing your transformation. It's quite an amazing transformation. And hopefully it will inspire others you know, to see the light. But I appreciate your time this morning, Frank. And, you know, keep preaching, keep spreading the good word. And hopefully, you know, we'll start to see some changes happen.
Thank you so much.
But I look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
All right. Frank, we need more Franks in this world for sure. Frank for president, Frank for everything this morning, just bringing, you know, the truth and speaking truth to power about these issues. My next guests are on the ground fighting every day to make real what Frank has written about and what he's been, you know, preaching for the last 35 years. So joining me this morning are Michelle Cologne. She is the executive director of Shero, Mississippi. Amanda Furdge, she's a community organizer and pro-choice advocate. And Edwith Theogene is the director of advocacy for Generation Progress. Good morning, ladies. You heard Frank Schaeffer say that this whole abortion debate really isn't about, you know, preventing women so much as having an abortion, but it's really about keeping women in subservient roles and preventing women from ever becoming equal to men. That resonates with me. I don't know about you, Edwith, but what do you think when you hear Frank speaking so honestly about the, you know, the agenda of those that would try to prevent women from controlling their reproductive health? Do you think we can, you know, is what he's saying going to have any headway with some of these folks?
I'm not sure if we'll have headway with some of the folks who are in opposition to women and people who have the ability to get pregnant. I don't know, but I think a lot of what Frank said did resonate with me. And something that I thought about while he was speaking was that if we really care about family values start with women. And my family's from Haiti, and we have a couple of sayings that come to mind. And one of them is pote mitan, which means hold center. And that is a term that is referred to women, because women are the center of everything, of family, of society, of country. So if we really value them, then we should really value their autonomy and honor where they come from and how they stand. So, I mean, a lot of what Frank said, I don't think is anything like jarring from what I know. And I'm sure my colleagues have tons to add about that as well. But I'm not trying to convince other people to see me as a human being or to see other people as human beings. I think I'm more invested in how do we shift power? How do we push forward a proactive abortion agenda? I'm not invested in this like cultural fight in the same way. But
great point, Michelle. Let me ask you that. Good question then. How do we push forward? We had a court that's 6-3, conservative majority. Doesn't seem to be any appetite on the part of Democrats to expand the court or to do anything that will upset the current balance of the court. And as long as that court is in place, moving forward with any agenda that gives women, people of color, women who are seeking abortions power seems pretty impossible.
I have to agree with everything Edwith said. And I think the main thing is that we definitely need a constitutional amendment that specifically protects abortion rights. In the Constitution is so ironclad that it cannot be dismantled, chipped away, just like the Second Amendment right to bear arms. I think that's the only, in my opinion, that's the only way that we can definitely be secure in knowing that abortion rights are not going to go anywhere in this country.
And 62% of Americans agree with you that women should have the right to abortions. But I want to, dig a little deeper on how do we get there? A constitutional amendment, we can't even get, 51 senators to vote for a bipartisan infrastructure bill that's going to provide for some of the, things that we know will make it easier for young women or any woman having a kid. So, Amanda, how do we move forward given the state of the politics as they are in Washington? I mean, we can't ignore, we got a 6-3 court. We've got a House that's probably going to flip in the midterms to become majority conservative. We got a razor thin margin in the Senate.
I think for me, it's about people power at this point. We know what we're up against as community, as families, as people. Shout out to Frank, who feel like, this is bigger than the issue that we're being fed. I think we just have to come together and figure out what we're going to do on our own. And then the Constitution is going to have to catch up, because I've always wondered why an issue like this would even need to be considered in a constitutional way. Why do we need a law for what we have already acknowledged is healthcare? Why do we need a law to protect a safe procedure that a choice that someone, deserves and has to make for their own well-being? So that's where I'm at. I'm at people power. And what are we doing in community to support and save ourselves? And they can chat and figure it out on their own.
Michelle, one of the things we've seen happen is like Amy Coney Barrett in her questioning, suggesting that adoption is the way forward, and that we should focus more on these safe haven laws, and that women aren't really burdened by pregnancy because they can have the child and then go give the child up for adoption. And they create this image that childbirth is somehow easy and simple. You just walk into a hospital, you drop the baby, you take it to a fire station, and you're back to work the next day. How do we dispel that myth and drive home, one, what we know for Black women is that pregnancy is dangerous, that you can die in childbirth, and carrying a child to term is a very complicated medical situation, and then giving birth can also, not only lead to major physical complications, but can literally kill you.
To death. Yeah. Well, first off, again, grassroots activism, talking to Black and brown women and pregnant people, and trusting Black women and brown women and Black and brown pregnant people. This narrative about look, I'm all for adoption and adopting, but let's be clear. We have an overabundance of children, real live children in, institutions. They're not being adopted at these fast rates that Justice Coney Barrett, wants to, project to the world. And especially Black and brown babies are not being adopted at fast rates. And while I understand that she has one, not white people are not adopting Black and brown babies at the same rate as they are white babies. And again, why would we continue to put not only pregnant people in this situation, like you said, jeopardizing their health, but also jeopardizing the life of a child once that child gets here, who we know does not have a high propensity of being adopted. They have a higher propensity of being in the system, which is going to impact them for the rest of their lives, and could be in a negative way.
Yeah, I saw a statistic that said in 2019, there were about 620,000 legal abortions. And at the end of that same year, there were still 122,000 children waiting to be adopted out of the foster care system. So although there are hundreds of thousands of kids adopted each year, there's more than 100,000 that are still left in institutions or foster care homes waiting to be adopted. Edwith, what we heard the professor say at the beginning of the show is that from the questioning that we saw and heard from those justices, it's pretty clear that the Mississippi 15-week ban is probably going to be upheld, and that Roe v. Wade is probably going to no longer be the law of the land pretty shortly. And what that means is that states will have their own ability to legalize abortion or not. And it's, experts are already predicting that if you live in the South, if you live in the Midwest, abortions are likely to be considered or to be deemed illegal. There'll be legislation passed in those states. There'll be some Democratic states like California, New York, where you probably still can get an abortion. But where does that leave activists? Where are the activists focusing now, knowing that the Roe v. Wade decision is probably going to be overturned by the Supreme Court?
I mean, the activists are already taking to the streets. I mean, Michelle, who's an amazing grassroots organizer, led a huge protest in Jackson, Mississippi just recently. I'm also here in Washington, D.C., and tons of people turned out in SCOTUS. And not only that, people are fighting for good policy and good legislation that's out there. People are fighting to codify the right to abortion into law. We have great bills like the Women's Health Protection Act, which already passed the House, and we just need the Senate to do their job. I mean, the real fear that exists is that if and when Roe v. Wade does fall, and we know just from what we heard in the oral arguments, it's looking pretty, like a reality. We know in fact that there's about 12 states which will ban abortion outright. And already now, abortion is already hard and difficult for so many people to get. So when we think about places like California, yes, but abortion is still really expensive for a lot of folks. There's also a bunch of different kinds of challenges that people have to navigate to receive an abortion. So Roe v. Wade is the floor, right? It's not the ceiling when we think about access. So we need to have state level policies. We need state legislators. We need federal legislators to be champions on this issue and to really fight to ensure that everyone has access to the full range of reproductive health and rights, and make abortion affordable for everyone. We need so many things to happen. And I think it's really important that we push forward a proactive abortion agenda. It's not enough to just protect and fight for Roe v. Wade. We need to do more than that. And that's the future I'm looking for.
Michelle, can you dispel some of the biggest myths about the vast majority of abortions that take place in this country? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation that's been disseminated about who gets abortions, where they live. But what are some of the biggest myths about abortions?
Oh, wow. Well, I think the biggest myth is saying that abortion is murder, because it's not. It's healthcare. It's essential healthcare, and abortion saves lives. We know that, look, everybody, there is no one certain, person who gets an abortion. We know that the majority of people who get abortions are people who are already parents, who've already had children. And for whatever reason. So, there's no one size model that fits all. But I will say this, that no one person's abortion is any more important than the others. And we need to respect that. And abortion needs to be available for any individual who may want to choose to terminate an unplanned, an unwanted, or possibly a pregnancy that is causing some type of health, life-threatening health issue to their lives.
Yeah, we didn't hear a lot, Amanda, in those arguments last Wednesday about incest, rape, the high, maternal mortality rates, the dangers that the U.S. is, quite frankly, a dangerous place to have a baby, particularly if you're a Black woman and particularly if you're in a certain state. Do you have any concerns now? I was reading a story about, even in Indiana right now, abortion is legal, but this doctor travels from New York because there are very few abortion providers in the state. You come into a clinic, she had to read something very scary to the woman who was seeking an abortion, some kind of statement basically shocking her that you're hurting this fetus. And then after she read it to the woman had to say she understood it. And the lady said, they say to your woman, she said, "I'm ready." And the doctor said, "Oh no, in this state, you've got to go home. You got to think about it. There's a waiting period. You still can't have this abortion for 18 hours later." And she said across the street were these protesters that were out trying to get her to come to this other clinic to give her information about adoption, et cetera. So, I think to Michelle's point, it's already difficult to have an abortion in this country. What can we do in those states that have legalized abortion, but yet continue to put these barriers in place, make it very difficult, try to guilt and shame women out of their decision-making process, and then, have all these, these hoops and hurdles they have to overcome in order to get the procedure?
I'm trying to find the question in there.
The question is, what can we do with these states that already have legalized abortion, but they're making it so difficult?
Okay, yeah. What we can do is to continue to support the people who have chosen to have an abortion, however they come to us, whatever advice we can give, whatever organizations we can provide, just however we can support them in making that happen. Because one thing that's gonna happen is that people are gonna have abortions, right? Laws can be put into place. People, especially people of color, where ingenuity, we're going to figure out a way to get done what needs to be done, right? Regardless, we hope that we are legally able and it's safe and it's supported and that life is good, but that's not our experience, right? So we live our whole lives figuring out how to do what we got to do. So what we can do as activists, organizers, people, who support the cause, people who support a person's right to live their life however they choose, we can just continue to stand in place and link up and send people where they need to go and do it for the right reasons. Because other than that, what else is there? It's not going to stop. You're not going to stop folks from taking care of themselves and taking care of their business or making the decisions that they feel are the right decisions for themselves, good or bad. You're not going to stop people. So we can just continue to do what we're doing, which is whatever we can.
And Michelle, you're in Mississippi, right? What's happening now on the ground?
Well, first off, the clinic is still open and still providing exemplary abortion health care for patients. What else is happening on the ground is, personally and organizationally, regardless of the outcome of this Dobbs case, myself and Shira will always do what it takes to ensure that pregnant people can get the abortion care that they need and can raise their families in safe, thriving communities. We are continuing to organize. We're continuing to have these conversations, intergenerational conversations with communities throughout the state about not only the current situation, because again, Mississippi has been existing in a post-Roe society for some time now, but we're also linking up and, strengthening our relationships with activists and organizers in various states and our neighboring states to get folks there if they need be. And the other thing is that we're doing an aggressive fundraising campaign to make sure that the local abortion funds in Mississippi have money to help people who are going to need those funds, because now it's going to take more money because they're going to have to travel longer, wait longer. The procedures will be, more expensive because these type of laws, and even in a state where you have one clinic, right, that still is a barrier because it pushes individuals' pregnancy, their term into, later term, which that's where the complications arise, right? So that's what we're doing here in Mississippi. We're definitely supporting abortion funds, making sure that they have the funding in their coffers so they don't have to turn anybody away. We're organizing in our communities, and we're not going to shiver in our resolve in protecting, defending abortion access and getting those pregnant people who no longer want to be pregnant, getting them to have a safe procedure.
Right. Fantastic. And Edwith, I'll end with you. It's your birthday. So first of all, happy birthday. Thank you for spending some of your birthday with us. Hope you're going to have a great rest of your day. Any final thoughts? Anybody that's out there that's trying to figure out what they can do to get involved, may feel helpless right now, may feel hopeless, having listened to these arguments last Wednesday. Any final words of encouragement?
I have a couple, so I'll just take the liberty for them. One, support an abortion fund. Right now is the time for us to really come together as a community, and whether that's resources, time, definitely find out who in your community is providing mutual aid and taking care of your community. Two, look into the legislation that's in your state. What are the challenges to access to abortion that exist in your state? Get educated and also fight against them and find your champions and find your challengers, identify who they are, and get involved with your local state level politics, and also get involved with the federal politics. The Women's Health Protection Act can provide that broadband support that people need. Abortion is healthcare, and it's essential, and we need a federal protection. The courts are not standing with us right now, so something's got to happen. And then second of all, this is something that Michelle, I don't remember where this came up in conversation, but I'll just share the thought. I think we need to talk to one another, right? We're in this situation because we've not talked about what does it mean for someone to be pregnant? What happens when you actually give birth? What happens when you need to have an abortion and you can't get one, or you had an abortion, it was a great experience. I think the more that we come together and just share these stories, the more important it is. It will break down a lot of these towers and mountains that stand before us. So just even having a simple conversation with your mom, what's my birth story? Having simple conversations with your friends. I don't know what the statistics are now, but it was like 1 in 3 people have had an abortion. Someone who's had an abortion. I'm sure you love someone who's had an abortion. Shout out to We Testify. So just have those conversations, talk to your people.
Yeah, excellent, excellent advice. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining me. Thank you for the work you're doing on the ground. I don't think there's anything more important right now than education, and knowledge is power. So people learning about what's happening at their state level is so important, because if the law falls at the federal level, then we're going to be looking to these states, and you need to know where your state is. Do you already have an abortion law on the books, and what that law looks like? But again, thank you all for just really helping us move this conversation forward. And yeah, let's just keep talking to each other. So important. All right. Just want to thank all of my guests this morning. Such an important topic. We keep coming back to it because it keeps coming up in the news, and it's such an important issue. If you are a woman, if you were born, if a woman gave birth to you, and that pretty much is all of us, right? A woman gave birth to all of us. This is an issue that you should care about. I think Frank put it best when he said this isn't just a woman's issue. This is a human rights issue, and it's the rights of women to control their own reproductive health. We're not sitting around figuring out what laws to make that control men and their reproductive rights, or anything about their health. So nor should we be doing that with respect to women. And I love what Frank said. Make sure you pick up his book, putting this argument in a broader context about this theology that has been in place for decades, designed to really keep women in a subservient role. I wrote a whole book called Awakening, which really talks about how we've been lied to as women, and how these systems that have been in place, these patriarchal systems, really are designed to oppress us in so many ways. So lots of folks are starting to talk about this, and I'm super excited about that. Just some words to live by before I get out. It's time for this country to have an awakening. Women are 51% of the population, but 70% of the poor in this country. Women, we are responsible for 100% of all births. Yes, we give birth to everybody. That's women. We are 83% of the single parents. We do 66% of the work. We produce 50% of the food, but we earn just 11% of the pay, and we own only 1% of the land in this country. Those are some statistics that should make you all shiver, and should, cause you to say, as Frank said, and as I've said, this country is in need, and is in dire need of an awakening here today. I'm out, y'all. Be safe. Wear your mask. Get your booster shot. Get vaccinated if you haven't already done so. And remember, we're all in this together.